folks, this is Danielle from sibylslab of Cartomantics, and this time around I thought I would make a video to talk about my planned practices for the month of October. Aside from it being my birthday month and it being the sort of month that we understand to be the thinned veil, I find it to be a really significant transition between the sort of September, beginning of school, slow warm up to this season, to a really depth going into hibernation period. So this is a meaningful shift for me. Plus, it's my birthday month, and so it's a time for some deeper work. I thought I would lay out what the themes are I plan on working with this month and talk about the decks that I think go along with supporting an exploration of those themes and the way that I plan to use those decks. So, pretty straightforward. The three things or themes that I want to work with this month, the three things I want to investigate are, and I took notes, fear and horror, the way that I understand fear and horror to operate for me. What am I afraid of? What do I find horrifying? How do those feelings and sentiments occupy space and change the way that I move around in the world? An interesting fact, I was born in Portugal and raised on the islands where we had no television channels. So, as a military family, we would have to rely on videos sent to us from the mainland, from the States in English, and they decided to send us a lot of horror movies. So little me got really into watching horror movies, and I'm the youngest of siblings who are about 10 years older than me, so I was watching probably age inappropriate things, but I have a real affinity for horror. So I have a high threshold, as you will see, for decks that are maybe leaning into the grotesque and the dark more than other folks might be able to. And yet, as much as I'm intrigued by sentiments of fear and horror, true horror and genuine fear are maybe seductive and titillating, but are also defining in a distressing way for all of us, whatever it is that we're truly afraid of. And so it's a month for me to investigate what I'm afraid of and what I may not be confronting. It's a really long way of explaining the first theme, fear and horror. The second thing I want to work with is the theme of descent to the underworld. As I said, this is a month that is really meaningful for a lot of us who celebrated Halloween growing up and have a very superficial understanding of this notion of the thin veil between the living and the dead. The idea that this is the period when we go into a shadow space and have greater access to what lies in the dark. I think there's something really rich about understanding my relationship to death in the underworld, whether or not it's the month of October. Maybe it is that inclination to enjoy and be seduced by horror and fear, but I've always understood myself as a person who has a particular intrigue with the notion of darkness and death and finds there to be gifts in the shadows. So the actual process of descent is really meaningful and powerful, and I use card work to work through that process and understand it, what it means to do that at this period in my life, at the age of 40, whatever, I'm not going to tell you. So how does that work, and what does it mean to actually engage in the descent? That is the second theme for the month. The third and final theme is the notion of the other world. So this is different from the idea of descent to the underworld, understanding that walk from light to shadow and embracing the month of October as the period for that journey of descent. But this is actually the other world and a really kind of Northern European folktale conceptualization of the other world, the place where magic lives, where stories live. If the veil is thin, it is not necessarily just thinned between the living and the dead, but it's thinned between what we see and what we do not see. And I am a person who loves myth, as I've talked about and as you'll see in my choices. But I want to investigate the difference between engaging with the underworld and underworld themes and engaging with the other world and what I can learn and excavate from the theme of the otherworld. So, again, fear and horror, descent to the underworld, and the other world through the veil. Those are my three themes. So, the decks and practices that I associate with each of those. The first one, fear and horror. The decks that I plan on using to do this work are Madame Wilhemina's tarot, what is sort of abbreviated to be Madame Wilhemina's tarot of like autumn and something, but we just call it Madame Wilhemina's. This deck goes in and out of print. It seems seasonally, so I'm not sure if it's in print right now. If it is, it would be during this season that it comes back in print. But it is a placeholder for me. It's a deck that works for me for this work. Please don't take it as a suggestion that if you don't have access to this out of print deck, there's no meaningful way to do this work. I hope that, and I'll show the cards as I talk, I hope that you're taking this more as a way of understanding the way that I engage with the season rather than a suggestion that this is the best deck for this kind of work. So, there are really superficial reasons that I find this deck to be good for working with fear and horror. It is so seasonally delicious, isn't it? Like, it is fall, autumn, palette. It is flirting with everything we appreciate about the month of October, and ghosts and ghouls and horror and death. But what do I like about it, aside from that superficial stuff? There is something so classic about the way that the creator has chosen to curate and collage her art. The sort of nostalgic vibe. It's a really like unsophisticated way of putting it, but this deck has an atmosphere, doesn't it? It takes us out of the present, and it takes us out of a kind of land of unfamiliar monstrosity. These are pieces of artwork that we know or are familiar enough with the styles that we know what they look like when they're normal, right? So this would be beautiful if we did not see, for example, this painting of Saint Sebastian that gets turned into the world. If we saw this original painting without the artistic changes that the creator has done, we would think, wow, that's a really beautiful painting. This painting is, I think, of Marie Antoinette. This is, I think, St. George. Like, if there were none of the amendments, none of the collage, this would be a beautiful representation of art in the romantic, medieval, pre-Raphaelite period, whatever period the art is from. This would be a world as we understand it through art history. But she takes the world that we know, that is familiar and beautiful, and lays a pallor of darkness over it. This isn't an illustrated deck that is, here are ghosts and ghouls and monsters. Here's a figure walking through a scary forest. This is a world with the veil of cleanliness and safety lifted off of it, and the grotesquerie and horror that is under that world that we see. So if we go into an art museum, here are pieces of art that we would see, but it feels as if this deck shows us what's actually underneath, what's exposed when the clean and the comfortable is lifted off. And I really love that. I also like that there is a real simplicity to reading this deck. It is very much a Rider-Waite-Smith tradition deck. If you know my reading style, I love a non-Rider-Waite-Smith tradition deck. I like things a little bit different, but this is already tender and complex work. Digging into what scares me. That's a really big question, and it's a really intense question. If I want to do that digging, that self-reflection, that honest analysis, it may not be the moment for me if I'm using a deck that isn't, my usual home deck. It's not the moment for me to get fancy and complicated and creative in what I'm reading for that work, what I'm bringing, the tools I'm using for that work. It is for me easier to just pick up art that I know how to work with. I know this Five of Cups, right? I know what a Six of Cups traditionally looks like. I'm not having to, if I pull this Seven of Cups, to answer a question about what I'm authentically afraid of today. I'm not having to sit and understand the nuance of this creator's very alternative or unusual approach to that archetype. It's a pretty straightforward deployment of the Rider-Waite-Smith structure of the card. What is untraditional, what makes this deck special in my practice, is exactly what I said about feeling like there is a veil lifted off of the art. So it is the world as we know it, but the dead figures that are underneath, that we may not be honest with ourselves have been there all along. So this is the tarot deck that I plan on using for this work. The oracle deck that I plan on pairing with it is Syrian Shadows, the Haunted Manor Oracle. I actually don't know. I backed this deck on Kickstarter years ago, and I'm not sure whether this is in print. I'll make a note in the description box below saying what's going on with it. I know that a lot of Syrian's decks have been coming out mass market, and I'll show these cards as I talk about them, have been coming out mass market. So this may be mass market or accessible. I know last year when I talked about this deck with someone, it was out of print at that time. But in any case, this deck is not alone in what it does. What do I think this deck does? It creates an environment. It's called the Haunted Manor Oracle, and it is exactly what it says it is. These are images from a manor. This is a haunted place, a haunted building, and different images from different corners of that building. Here are the cards laid out in the card room, and the meaning of this. Play the hand that's dealt. That's the message of cards. Winter, so it's winter in the manor. Frozen in time is what we can take from this card. So if I am using the Madame Wilhemina Tarot to invite in the Rider-Waite-Smith symbols, but with the veil of comfort lifted off of them and the death and horror exposed underneath, this deck helps me locate myself while I'm doing that work. I made a video before about decks for dark rooms. So I like a metaphor of a place or a building as a site for doing work and doing dark work. So this deck very much fits with that. If I am investigating fear and horror, which is itself kind of depth, like imaginative work, it helps me get into a place to do that work if I understand where I am in my imagination while I do that work. I hope that makes sense. So if I'm in the chess room, if I pull chess and I'm in the chess room, stand firm in your choice. I have a foundation, like a literal room, a foundation, a space for me to do the investigation that I'm talking about. So let me say how I will work with these decks, and maybe that'll give a sense of like their language together, the magic they make together. I'm going to go back to my notes. I like choosing 1 to 2 decks that I work with for daily draws for a month, and not just what's my card today or like what's the energy of the day. That's fun. but not my favorite thing now that I feel pretty fluent in the different languages of tarot. Every day this month, the month of October, I plan on asking the question and journaling on the question, what fear is at the forefront for me today? That might be a fear of time. I don't know about you, sometimes time feels like a prison to me. I'm probably the only one, right? But it might be a fear of waning energy. It might be a fear of failure in a really big way, right? It could be big stuff or small stuff. You guys know I have an ill dog. It could be a fear for my dog's health. Fear that my husband is going to experience burnout because he's been working lots and lots lately. So that could be a range of things. And, I think that it's helpful to think about asking this question every day because it really makes it clear that doing this work with fear and horror doesn't have to be the big life-shifting archetypal conversation every time. Like, what is my overarching fear of life? What horrifies me to my core and has been there since childhood? All good questions and all great fodder for self-discovery, but not the only way to engage. Like, on a day-to-day basis, I'm not thinking necessarily about like the horror that has been buried deep since childhood. It might be down there, right? It might be underneath what is what it is that I'm reading about. But when I think about how to approach my day, it might help to just look at what's on the surface. And then I can do that depth work later if I feel like it. But this is a way that I plan on investigating these decks and doing my daily draws this month. I've lately been, for my daily draws, writing a poem every day, a one-page, maybe, probably, mostly not great poem. It's been an interesting experience to write some piece of poetry every day, and what I found helpful about it is that it takes me out of my air mind, my overly rational, intellectual, hyper-attuned correspondences mind, and invited me to something more visceral and emotional. There is no musing about the moon in Libra for the Two of Swords if I'm telling myself, let's come up with some lines of evocative, language that explain what I feel when I look at a moon over a woman holding two crossed swords. I say that to say that for my daily draws this month, when I think about journaling, I plan on pulling two cards and continuing that practice to see if it works for me. Just writing one page of poetry. And let me make this clear, guys. This is not beautiful art. I'm a literature professor. It is shameful, the poetry I'm writing. This is not poetry I would share. But it's more about the act of vulnerability, the forced lifting of the intellectual and sort of cracking open my insights and leaning into that than it is about the poetry itself. And maybe out of 30 days, one will be really, really good. Maybe I'll share a few with you at some point. But for an example, I'm pulling one card from Madame Wilhemina and one card from the Haunted Manor Oracle to say what it is I'm most afraid of this month. Let's see how these cards work together. The Tower and Absinthe. Practice in restraint. So let's see. If I understand, absinthe is the space, the four corners in which I'm doing this inquiry. I have a very structured sense of how I'm going to be doing this work. This is practice and restraint, quite literally. I have shown you the 2 decks. I have told you what question I'm going to be asking every day, precisely how many cards I'm going to pull, one of each. So that is the room that sets the tone for my answer to this question. Now the Tower. I mean, every time I look at this card, I think like, holy cow, look at that background. It is destruction wrought. It is a world that has been pillaged, that looks like. It's kind of like the Ten of Swords, Lord of Ruin kind of thing. I think there's something I'm anxious about with figuring out how to balance over structure, that very clear restraint, 2 cards a day, specific question, and balancing that with an excavation that is extremely exposing, ruinous. Like, we're talking about horror, people. So this is like, what is buried under there, my raw self? That's pretty intense. And I don't know that too much structure and restraint is the best way to approach that. So given this information, I think that this is a good way, some good rethinking for how structured I maybe plan to be about this work. Maybe I will do daily draws and not ask a specific question, just see what cards come up in relationship somehow to fear and horror or something. But that's an interesting insight. Okay, my second theme, the descent into the underworld. All right, I'm using one deck here that is familiar to me and that I've worked with, and one deck that I haven't really. I've had it a long time, but haven't really worked with it and maybe shouldn't. Like, this is probably my last gasp with this deck to see if it's worth keeping around, but the first one, the tarot deck, I know is. So this tarot deck is the Tarot of Persephone's Garden Chthonian edition. I know last I checked, this is still in print. This particular edition is. This deck is by Kara Small, who sells on Etsy, and I like this card. This is the Orphic hymn to Dark Persephone that she has printed in script to come along with the deck. So, with seeds of pomegranate, bold and red, in autumn you return to the land of dread. O Persephone, Chthonian, goddess of life and death, darkness falls by winter's breath. I'll show the cards as I talk about working with Dark Persephone for this theme. A lot of us, when we think of Persephone, think of Persephone as the maiden who was abducted, or think of her in relationship to the emergence of spring. If we contemplate her descent into the underworld, it's either in connection to the version of her myth that's deeply distressing, right? A violent abduction and violation, which is the traditional myth associated with Persephone's abduction to the underworld. Or we think of Demeter's grief at losing her daughter and searching for her. Or we think of the beauty of her reemergence and the flowers that come and all of the sort of wonder at rebirth in the spring. I, before doing this kind of work, never thought meaningfully about the gifts of Dark Persephone, about embracing her as queen of the underworld, about understanding the profound power that I think she wields as a queen of death. She goes from a maiden who doesn't even have a name. Like, when she is Demeter's daughter, picking flowers and wandering around before her abduction, or, agreeable descent, however it is she came to be with Hades, she did not have a name. She was Kore, right? She descends, and that's when she gets her name, and that's when she becomes queen. That's when she reigns over the land of the dead and has an actual role in Orpheus's efforts to get his love back. Like, she has power there. That's where she becomes a woman and steps into her authority. So that idea of the descent into darkness and death, metaphorical death, right? And mythic death. The idea that that is where she finds agency, that that is where she finds power and maturity, is beautiful to me. And is difficult enough that I want to investigate it. I want to lean into it more. I mean, this deck, and here's the thing. So that's why I like the idea of engaging with Dark Persephone in her myth this time. The reason that this deck is great for it is because it was literally made for that, right? We have the pomegranates on the back. I have the original Tarot of Persephone's Garden. This is the Chthonian edition, so probably half the artwork is changed. And I thought when this came out, you know, I liked the original deck enough that I wanted to see what the differences were. And I appreciated the idea of like naming the second edition with the re-selected artwork something different. I don't know that I really expected such a carefully curated collection of works that truly invite descent into Chthonian, into the underworld. I think that I expected, like, okay, it's a little bit more shadowy, still the same energy of Tarot of Persephone's Garden. This is truly a chthonic edition. This deck is perfectly indexed to the dark descent. Look at this Seven of Wands. The idea of this as a figure of confrontation and valor. She is frightening and assertive and doesn't just represent that, but she's looking at us with a sort of unfriendliness, a kind of hostility and confrontation. We will meet faces like her on our own descent. Look at this as a Nine of Wands. This is so nuanced. This is unlike any Nine of Wands we would find in a traditional Rider-Waite-Smith deck. This is a Nine of Wands wholly grounded in the notion of what it means to balance that archetype, the archetype of kind of resilience, survival, being a little beat up from battle, but holding your ground or setting boundaries, and being pulled to the dark somehow in relationship to romance and seduction, and seduction by death, right? There's just something really beautiful and powerful, and I think perfect about this deck for doing that work. I have to say, you know, there is a deck whose name is not coming to mind immediately, but a deck of pre-Raphaelite art that people are dying for because it's been long out of print, and I'll probably note the title and the video description if I can't remember it. But I think that people are hungry for this deck mostly because it's out of print and it's beautiful art. But it is very much a kind of similar spirit of Greek myth and pre-Raphaelite art. I think this deck is better. I've looked at that deck. I don't have it. This is just a really good deck. I'll say that. That's all to say. This is a really great deck for a really fair indie price. I do love some linen cardstock, and I think it's really special. And it's been in and out of print. not for scarcity's sake, but she's an indie creator who sometimes has it on hand and sometimes doesn't. So if it's something that you like and work that you want to do, I think it's really worth grabbing. So I will share, that is Tarot of Persephone's Garden Chthonian edition. As I share the Oracle deck, so the Oracle deck I'm going to be showing is Gospel of Aradia by Stacey DeMarco. This is an older, like been around a long time Oracle deck. I trimmed my copy of the deck because I wanted it a little bit smaller and I thought it was good, you know, better for the hand. Let me read just the back of the box to give you a sense of what the spirit of the deck is supposed to be, because the myth of Aradia is very specific. The story of Aradia is steeped in mystery. Was she a goddess or a flesh and blood woman? To some, she was the first witch, to others, the leader of a resistance movement, and still to more, a wise teacher with female disciples, a spiritual mentor and a powerful role model for women to aspire to. There are not too many cards, 34 cards. I love the artwork of Jimmy Manton, which is mostly why I got this deck. But this is about Aradia, the first witch, who is, in some myths, said to be the daughter of Artemis or Diana. Here's the thing. It matches the palette and spirit of the Dark Persephone myth and Tarot of Persephone's Garden perfectly, I think. And I'll show you these images as I talk. I don't know. Like, I think it's really pretty, and I love Jimmy Manton's art, and it's simple enough, right? Like the theme of peacemaking. Okay. The theme of games as a card symbolizing luck, synergy, fortune. The thing about this deck, I don't tend to like decks that are less than, say, 40 cards, 42 cards. It doesn't feel like, unless they're like a fortune-telling deck, Lenormand, Kipper, whatever, like they have quite enough cards to do all of the work. So I enter this with skepticism. That said, I do think that this hits on very basic divine feminine, dark feminine themes and aesthetics and symbols. I think it does the symbolic work of this theme just fine. The theme of reconciliation and the older and younger woman certainly speaks to what we find with Persephone and Demeter, and Persephone sort of graduating from her mother to descend and become queen of the underworld. This does a fine job of gesturing at that and leaving room for Tarot of Persephone's Garden to dig deeper into that. I like the continuity of the art. So we see Aradia over and over, right? Obviously, and unsurprisingly. I love that, though. I love feeling like there is a character to follow through these images, and that all of the archetypes are speaking, all of the symbols are a part of a single story. And it's easy for me to identify with her then and feel like, oh, this is me becoming queen, right? This is the face that I saw in the other cards becoming queen. Or this is me as a part of union. And it's me, just like it's Dark Persephone, just like I'm her, right? Like the unity and the coherence of this deck and it being a story of Aradia ties nicely into a deck that is meant to tell the story of Dark Persephone and her descent, is perfect to tie with my own story of understanding this moment as a period of metaphorical descent to the underworld. So there's something beautiful and symmetrical about that. All of that said, I wonder if there are other decks that could do this work a little bit better and more fully, but I don't know, and I've never really given this deck a chance. I trimmed it years ago and then just sort of put it down and thought like, man, I love Jimmy Mann's artwork, but didn't do anything with it beyond that. So this is my favorite card on the whole deck, the Night Women. Ugh, look at that. There's something though that I think is really worth giving a shot here, but I approach with skepticism. So let's see, right? This isn't just about exploring descent to the underworld, but it's kind of about testing that deck and seeing whether it's going to stick around for my future work. So how am I going to work with this idea of descent to the underworld and dark Persephone and whatever? Like, am I pulling a card every day? No, I'm not. I don't like doing daily draws for lots of different things, and this month I've decided that my daily draw in some way is going to have to do with that theme of fear and horror. So let's leave the daily draw for that. How am I going to work with this? I like when I'm doing goddess work, and I do a lot of goddess work and myth work, having a structured way of exploring a myth, because there are lots of myths I want to work with and don't know in any depth or meaningful way, and want to give full, not give short shrift, really want to open myself to the nuance and fullness of that archetype. So for example, I've done some work with Hel or Hela from Norse mythology. I'm not an expert in Norse mythology, and when I work with her, I really need to give myself over to the investigation of her unique story. I've done a lot of work with Persephone, spring, youthful, maiden Persephone, and a little bit with dark Persephone, but this is a moment for me not only to use this as a metaphor for my own descent, but really investigate, like, what are the versions of her descent? Was she abducted? Did she consent? What was that process? Why did she eat the pomegranate seed? Like, all of that. As a literature person, like, the scholar in me is like, man, let's understand that story, right? That's just amazingly interesting. So the scholar is like, ooh, let's ask some questions and do some analysis and whatever. But kind of spiritually or developmentally or emotionally speaking, that investigation helps me develop a picture of Persephone that I can dialogue with as I draw cards and journal. So I have two spreads that I tend to work with when I'm doing mythic work that try to get at the nuance of that goddess's myth and how my story in some way parallels what's going on in that goddess's myth, but in very specific ways. If I'm working with dark Persephone in 2 years, there are going to be different ways in which what's happening for me parallels some part of her story. So I'm talking very specifically about this moment. What part of her descent fits in a meaningful, deep way with some part of my own, moment of descent this month. So I'm going to be doing, over the course of the month, 2 pretty expansive spreads. I like to do, when it's a big spread like that, actually do the spread, take a photograph, do some journaling, and journal here and there more deeply about the spread. So like, if I'm doing a basic analysis and I have my picture, and first impressions, and here's what I think is the message of this spread, I have a week to go back, look back at that picture, think, I'm not quite sure what like that pairing means. What else, what more cards can I pull to help make sense of that part of the spread, so that by the end of that period of journaling, I feel like I really have dug in. I've really gotten in there. So those 2 spreads and some general journaling through that process, some dialogue. For each spread position, each of the spreads has 7 positions, and I pull 1 tarot and 1 oracle card for each of those positions. And then as I do my kind of, expansive investigative journaling throughout the month to dig into those spreads, I do draws from the decks that I'm using as well. So one tarot and one oracle card per question. If there's a spread position that is like, what was her motivation when she made X choice? I'm going to pull one tarot and one oracle card to see what those two cards have to say to further, contextualize what it is I found in the original draws. So that's how it's going to shape up for me this month. And let's see what that does. The final theme this month is the other world, working with the other world. So the thinning of the veil that isn't just this life and deceased lives, or, the lives of those who've passed. There's certainly, as a Catholic, right, the idea of All Saints and All Souls Day, like the veil having thinned and us having access to people who were here and are no longer here. But I'm talking about the veil thinning between what we see and what we do not see, this world and the other world that's been here all along. I will show first the oracle deck and then the tarot deck. The oracle deck that I'm going to be working with is the newer Fairy Tale Heroine Oracle by Sharon Blackie. She is well known for her book If Women Rose Rooted and plenty of other works. She's a scholar, folklore historian, diviner, has online courses. She's a phenomenal scholar of myth and women's myth and Celtic myth in particular, English and specifically Celtic mythology. I'll show these cards as I talk. But this new Fairy Tale Heroine Oracle, obviously, this means that I'm going to be looking at the part of the other world that is coded to the feminine story. Like, right? Like the notion of divine womanhood as it provides the context for what we see and do not see in that other world. The other world is not defined as a feminine experience, so just to make that clear. But my own work with it, my own investigation of it is going to be grounded in that approach. In part, that works and feels obvious because if you do work with Celtic mythology and European, especially Northern European mythology, so much of the mythology around the other world, the storytelling and folklore, is grounded in goddesses and heroines. So the themes that we find in this deck, the figures and places and tools and actions, those are the 4 categories that we find in the deck. There are places, there are, I think, allies, actions, and tools. And all of them are connected to generalized archetypes that we find across primarily European, Northern European Celtic folklore, but connect to folklore in general. Certainly, like the witch's cottage we find in Baba Yaga Slavic folklore, or the Wall of Thorns we're gonna find in Southern European folklore, or the fairy hill. The notion of fairies is not European only, or hearth. So there's these very basic symbols that are not locked to, there's Baba Yaga, locked to single myth, the wise old woman. But I find that these are beautiful symbols for my own efforts in this time to access the other world, what it is, how I can understand it, and what I have to gain from it. Because this isn't just about let's investigate this interesting concept. Sometimes it is. Like, I'm curious about this stuff. I'm a nerd for it. You probably are too, or you wouldn't be watching this video. So sometimes it's just fun to like think about what this stuff means or where it comes from. But as I'm talking about it as a sort of transformational theme of my work this month, I find engagement with fairy tale and folklore stories of my childhood, my formation of my understanding of femininity and my own womanhood, right? So, like, what stories taught me about what it means to be a girl in the world, my vulnerability and strength, whatever. And what did I believe? This is the key for me. What did I believe was true about worlds, about the other world, that meant that it had to be true about this world? So, what did I understand to be the strengths and vulnerabilities and fears and powers and tools available in magical worlds that define what is the truth and possibility in this world? It's really inner child work, otherworld work and investigation as it intersects with inner child work. And that's why the fairy tale heroine oracle is really kind of perfect for this. That's why, I've shown you tarot and oracle decks. I'm starting with oracle deck in this pairing because it's primarily oracle deck that is going to form the foundation of this work, and the tarot deck is going to serve the oracle deck. And the other pairings, it's really tarot deck with oracle deck at its service, and here it's the other way around. The tarot deck that I'm pairing with the fairy tale heroine oracle is the Kazanlar Tarot. This is a deck that's still in print. Emil Kazanlar, the artist, I believe has passed. I trimmed off the bottom titles. The deck is still in print, but you do have to order it from overseas. I'm not sure, given the moment that it is in United States trade, whether that's actually still possible. But I do know, last I checked, it was still available for online ordering. It is a spendy one, though. But this deck is so profoundly gorgeous. It is all about the other world. It is a deck that shows the sort of Egyptian god villain Seth and the Egyptian hero Horus. We have, this, what is it? This Mogul knight on a camel with gold at its feet. We have a queen sitting on a cushion among her wealth. An Indian or Hindu god. Like, it's so gorgeous. So the wands in this deck are Buddhist Hindu mythology. The cups are Hungarian, sort of Eastern Christianity mythology, symbology. The swords are ancient Egyptian, and the coins or discs are the Moguls. I adore this deck. It's really important to me. It has a unique take on its approach to the Kabbalah. As you see, the names of the Sephirot are on the top. So Tiferet for the 6 of spades or swords. You see some similarity, right, to the traditional Rider-Waite-Smith 6 of swords, the boat, but we have Newt bent over and protecting those who are paddling away. And then we have this Seven of Swords that's unlike any Seven of Swords that we're used to seeing. This is an ecumenical deck. The notion of the ecumenical is a kind of co-equivalent intersection of spirituality, the idea that there's a kind of transcendent matrix of spiritual beauty, that like there's something meaningful and tied together about spiritual inquiry, that it makes sense, for example, that we have the god Thoth in the same deck as we have, for example, the King of Cups is Saint Stephen. It's not just a novelty. I think in some decks it's not unheard of that you would see decks that have those two together, right, in a deck somehow. Here, there is a genuine underpinning of belief. Like, there is a real sentiment of, like, authentic belief in the transcendent power of the Buddha that we find in the Six of Wands, alongside the, I think this is Sinbad, alongside the myth of Sinbad. These are not matters of sort of convenient representation, like, oh, we needed to paint a Five of Discs. Why not do the story of Sinbad? Or why not have the story of Osiris? This is a depiction of Osiris grounded in like an absolute belief in his reincarnation and its meaning. And that is connected to what we find here in the Knight of Wands. There's just something, I'm being very inarticulate, but the ecumenical sort of encompassing nature of this, and the fact that it's not indexed just to the feminine and divine feminine, but it is a kind of fullness of representation of folklore and fairy tale and myth and spirit and religion, makes it feel nice and balancing for that inquiry into the other world through the lens of the heroine. So even though I'm putting this deck at the service of that heroine pathway into the other world, this deck keeps me grounded in the fullest understanding of who and what we find narratively in that other world. All right, folks. So once more, we have my three themes, which are the investigation of fear and horror, the investigation of underworld descent, and this investigation of the other world. And I didn't say for this work with the Kazanlar Tarot and the Fairy Tale Heroine Oracle, this will be more grounded in deck study than my other ones. So we have the daily draw, we had the work with kind of standard myth spreads that I like to do. With this pairing, I see myself pulling one card. Let's say we're pulling, let's find one. Here's Saint Stephen. And I'm going to pull this, and I'm going to pull it next to apprenticeship. And as I sit and journal, and I'm probably going to do this a couple times a week, I'm actually going to read the guidebook entry for apprenticeship. Of course, sometimes I'm going to read the guidebook entries for the cards that I pull and other things, but those aren't priorities. Like, those are, I kind of feel like it, or I'm kind of curious, but I try to make a point to first do my journaling and then maybe kind of look things up on the back end. This is, I'm pulling these cards and I'm actually going to go to the book. Sharon Blackie is a really important writer to me. So I want to know what she has to say about her choice for apprenticeship, her specific identification of symbols within this card, how I can understand what it gestures to about the journey of Heroine. And then as I'm journaling about like what I find there and what I find in the guidebook, I can use this card, the King of Hearts or King of Cups, to guide the questions I ask or how I dig into what I find in that guidebook for Fairy Tale Heroines Oracle, if that makes sense. So it's a really lengthy way of saying, like, that's my third theme, otherworld work. I hope this was interesting to you and gives you a sense of how at least I go about structuring my study of decks for a month, my tarot practice as I conceptualize it. It's going to come out on the other end looking different probably than I intend, but that's how I'm going into the month. Those are my ambitions, and we'll see how they shake out. As we like to do on this channel, I will be doing a reading for the collective. I'll use the Kazanlar Tarot because he is a treasure to me, and the question that I'll be reading for all of us is, what for the month of October should we reach for? What should we keep in mind as we set our ambitions for our October practice? All right, the magic between the two cards. First card, 3 of Coins. Shuffle one more time. Second card, Knight of Wands. So what do we see in these images actually? So the 3 of Coins, we see her shaking coins off of the tree. She's doing the work of kind of harvesting, right? Of like getting the fruits, shaking the fruits off of what she's grown already. So actually seeing the material outcomes of her labor, like actually feeling the material, practical, secondary benefits of the work that she's done. And the Knight of Wands, he is energetic, ambitious, powerful, a little reckless, high energy. He is running into things, and with this elephant, he's quite showy about it. He is one who likes to be the center of attention and feels himself powerful enough to rein in such an incredibly large, powerful animal. I mean, he's on the back of an elephant directing it to his will. So for these 2 cards, I have really big, and you do too according to these cards, we have really big ideas about what this month can look like, what is possible during this month. It's an adorned elephant. It's large and beautiful and powerful, and something big that we're trying to rein in and understand ourselves as powerful enough to do that. And we are powerful enough to do that. This is a lot of deck and a lot of symbology and a lot of beautiful art and a lot of like creative thought that's gone into all of this stuff that I've just shown you, right? This is like a behemoth I'm trying to manage and control. This 3 of Coins is reminding me to go through that process of shepherding my elephant, that great big stuff that I've shown us and talked us through, to go through that process of steering it by the power of its fruits. So not just completing the to-do list I've laid out. So feeling like, okay, I did my first spread for my descent into the underworld. And for this first week, I did my daily draws every day and wrote my poem. And, I made sure that I looked up 5 cards in Sharon Blackie's Oracle. No. The way to do this is to feel like I'm reining this in. I'm directing the power of these tools by the fruits that I see. And I like that there are 3 of these because I just laid out 3 themes. The fruits that I see for each of these themes. So if I only do my daily draws for 4 days of that first week, did I get the poems done? And I feel like there was good fruit that came from that. And for my Sharon Blackie Oracle work with Kaz and Lar Tarot, did I feel like, man, I saw a real symmetry between the pairings that I found. The way that, the 7 of Cups spoke to the 2 cards that I pulled from Sharon Blackie's Fairy Tale Heroines Oracle. Those are the only cards that I pulled for the first week, but I really felt like there was magic that happened and I got something from that. Like, the measure for you and me this month is to feel like we're going to end up on the other side of this month and we will have seen the fruits of all of these grand ambitions, and that's going to be the measure of how well we controlled the elephant. Oh, man, I love a metaphor. We're controlling the elephant. All right, friends, this is great fun for me. I hope this is fun for you. I will put all of my contact stuff and our information for Sibyl's Lab in the video description below, as well as a list of the decks that I used. I hope that your day is great and that your month of October practice is grand. And until next time, friends, I will see you in the lab. Bye.